in Texas, an explosion of data centers, massive facilities powering everything from generative AI to the streaming apps on our phones, is putting new pressure on an already strained resource, water. While state leaders have touted the economic benefits of such projects, Texas Tribune environmental reporter Alejandra Martinez has found a lack of regulation and oversight may lead to some serious challenges in the years ahead when it comes to how to address a likely surge in water demand. Alejandra Martinez, good morning.
Hi, Craig. Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. First, how and why do data centers consume water?
Yeah, so data centers consume water two ways. One they call direct consumption, which is data centers have these cooling systems that basically take the heat that is generated from these computing systems and servers and figures out a way to keep them cold so they can't malfunction or fail, essentially. So during that process, there are a variety of different cooling systems that data centers can use, but the essence is like in that process, there's a huge amount, or there could be a potential huge amount of water that is used. And then the second is um, through electricity. The power needed to run these data centers is immense. And so through power generation, there is that water use. And depending how big that data center is, will determine how much power is used, and then also the type of energy resource that they use. So our grid is vastly powered by natural gas and stuff. So that is what is feeding the data center. But some data centers, specifically in Central Texas, are starting to use their own power resources. And so a lot of researchers, specifically in Houston, the Houston Advanced Research Center is kind of pushing for data centers to look at renewable energy, solar and wind as potential power resources because that would dramatically reduce their water demand as well.
Do we know how much water is being used that otherwise wouldn't be if these data centers weren't around?
Yeah, so the percentage is at the moment small. The Houston Advanced Research Center, it's that independent nonprofit research organization that I mentioned that's based out of Houston, has been estimating existing data centers in Texas's water use, and they account that in 2025, data centers will use 25 billion gallons of water, which if you take that with the whole state, that is 0.4%. But they do warn that with this increase in data centers, there are currently 400 of them in Texas. There are 70 on the way. There is a huge federal push for data centers, AI data centers. I think earlier this week, Governor Abbott announced that there will be two more in addition to the one that's already being built in Abilene. These are massive data centers, some the size of, that Abilene data center is the size of New York Central Park. So huge, huge data centers. This research organization warns that this demand could increase by up to 2.7%, just knowing what we know now. But if there are more data centers on the way, it could even get higher. And that is equivalent, just to give you a number, to the water consumption of 1.3 million average US households.
Now, all of that said, it sounds like maybe the issue isn't strictly speaking the percentage of demand across the entire state so much as the impact that this can have on some communities, particularly, am I right, out in the Panhandle?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, you take the data center in Abilene, for example. That data center is being built in an area that is historically a little bit more dry. There is another data center, an AI data center being built in Amarillo, a historically dry area. Um, and the two that have been announced are that I mentioned earlier are pegged to be built also in like the Panhandle and West Texas area. And so there is research out of Purdue that shows that in Texas specifically, there are data centers being built in more dry areas as opposed to wetter areas that receive a lot of rain. And so in other states, some data centers are being built near like very wet, near water, cooler environments, in some ways to help that heat that is being generated from the data centers. And that is not what is happening here. So, in those communities, going back to HARC, the Houston Advanced Research Center, their lead researcher, Miss Margaret Cook, who's been leading this data center stuff, said that those communities are going to be the hardest hit because their water management isn't ready for that big of a demand that a data center could bring.
That said, I imagine those communities, those areas of Texas where there's a lot of drier land, that's probably also where there's just a lot of land available, and that's why these things are
Yes,
getting built where they are.
exactly.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of times the Houston Advanced Research Center and their estimates. Why is it that we have to rely on estimates from an organization like that to calculate what kind of water usage we're seeing from these data centers? Why don't we get more exact totals?
Yeah. So it goes back to how data centers consume water. I talked about through their cooling systems and also where they need their energy or power, right? And while the Texas Water Development Board is the state agency that tracks water consumption, while the TWDB tracks historical use through, they have sent out surveys to a couple of these data centers asking them to essentially self-report how much water they're using, and then they kind of cross-reference it with if they get it from a municipality, it is what they said, and what the municipality said the same thing, right? But experts kind of say that just shows us what has been used, and it's really hard with the growing demand to understand how much they will use or to future forecasts. And that is what they're saying is the limitation the state has right now. And so, what HARC did in Houston, the research center, is look at that historical consumption, but also the different types of energy or where data centers get their power from, and did this like very advanced calculation way out of my range to determine how much water is being used there through that energy power source. But even then, on top of that, there are several caveats. What type of data center is it? What type of cooling system do they use? Because that determines how much water they use. And oftentimes, these companies don't disclose that information to the public. And even with the Water Development Board surveys, I think they sent out 70 and only 30% actually responded, even though responding to their surveys is required by law.
You mentioned cooling centers, or what kinds are used can dictate how much water gets used. And that raises the question of technology and whether or not these environmental concerns today will be less of a concern tomorrow with better efficiency, better technological improvement in the development of cooling centers. Could they, over time, just use less water? Is there any evidence to suggest that may be the case?
Yeah, that is definitely the goal, right? So, in Arlington, the University of Arlington, there is a group of doctoral students that, with help from a Department of Energy grant, they are innovating how can data technology, these cooling systems, how can data centers use less water? And so knowing or having in mind that water is tied to both energy and the type of cooling system that you have, they are trying to both reduce the energy and reduce how much water these systems use. And so the technology that they've been developing is a liquid, not water. So moving away from water, developing this liquid chemical mixture that cools the data center chips directly, as opposed to having like body of tubes circulating around these big computer machines that are water, right? That is water, right? And so what they are calling it is two-phase liquid cooling, which means it goes from liquid, it evaporates when it cools the chip directly, and then they condense it, and then it turns back into liquid. And so with that, they are estimating that power reduction is about 35% less than what the average data center uses for cooling their systems. And so so that is one approach, but talking to the industry, they're really wanting to reduce their power consumption because they don't want to be using their power to cool their systems. They want to be using their power to power their computing system. And so there are big incentives, specifically here in Texas, to do that.
Alejandra Martinez is an environmental reporter with the Texas Tribune. Alejandra, thank you very much.
Thank you.